Story starts with our main character, Damdiok, who is seen in an interview. He answered various questions asked by the interviewers. Unfortunately, after checking his resume, they discovered that he had no talent. They mocked him and questioned why he had applied to an organization like theirs without any talent. This made Damdiok angry, and a flashback was quickly shown to the time when the dungeons were revealed, and people started obtaining hidden abilities, which they called talent. This helped civilization to develop rapidly, and some people considered talent to be a blessing for humanity. The protagonist also thought the same until he found out that he had no talent. Then we cut to the present, where the interviewers were making fun of the protagonist for his lack of talent. With a determined look on his face, the protagonist told the interviewers that they were making discriminatory comments towards people without talent. The interviewers ridiculed the protagonist's comment, but he urged them to apologize. They refused to do so, and with no other choice, the protagonist showed them that he had recorded their entire conversation. The interviewers were shocked and begged the protagonist to forgive them, but he refused and made a threatening remark before leaving. Feeling satisfied, the protagonist left the building, but later received a text saying that his complaint had been submitted to the Human Rights Committee. Still upset about not having any talent, he called talent a bullshit to humanity. He then accidentally stepped on gum, which made him even more furious before being splashed with water by a worker. The protagonist looked up at the sky and sighed, realizing what a bad day he was having. On his way back home, the protagonist noticed vomit on the wall and decided to clean it. While he was on the phone with his mom, he asked about her well-being but was interrupted when his mom blamed herself for their current financial situation, wishing they could pay back their uncle's debts. This angered the protagonist, who urged her not to talk about it. After some conversation, he ended the call and went outside to smoke. It started raining, which made him angry, and he cursed the sky until lightning struck him. As he passed out, he thought of his mother and wondered what would happen to her without him. When he woke up, he was surprised to be alive and saw a notification saying that the gods were hiring him. He went to his room, pondered his life, and saw a notification above his head. He tested whether the lightning that struck him was a talent but got no response. He then said the phrase, "part-time notice," which opened a global scale system. The protagonist was amazed and determined to take the opportunity given to him. However, he was denied access to certain jobs due to a lack of divine power. He searched for jobs that did not require divine power and found a part-time job creating a dungeon. Excited, he accepted the job and was transported to an unknown location. The protagonist, Damdiok, is unexpectedly attacked by a monster, but is saved by a large, muscular man who introduces himself as Thor, Odin's son, and welcomes him. On their way to the dungeon construction site, Damdiok is in shock that the man is actually Thor. He is briefly caught off guard when Thor asks if he is a god, but he nervously confirms that he is the god of a small mountain. Thor laughs and calls him the god of mountains, saying that he has heard a lot about him. Upon arriving at the dungeon construction site, Thor shows Damdiok the dungeon concept, which turns out to be a huge maze, stunning him as he is going to help in building it. The scene shifts to Damdiok working hard, and he is then called by Sector C1 and told to take a short break. While resting, he and Sector C1 have a conversation about the gods. They then move to the next work point where they have to place traps. While unloading the carriage, Damdiok almost steps on a trap, but is stopped and made aware of the sign of a trap. Stunned, Damdiok and Sector C1 carry on while talking. C1 decides to show Damdiok a dungeon room they have just finished creating where they placed egg spawn and lizard men. They keep walking until they arrive at the goblin shelter, which is closest to the final destination. While walking, Damdiok is suddenly attacked by a goblin, but this turns out to be a prank from the goblin. Although Damdiok is annoyed, they all laugh it off. After making their way through the labyrinth, Damdiok and C1 finally reach the boss room, where they are unexpectedly met by Thor, who is amazed by Damdiok's progress. Thor offers his compliments and inquires about Damdiok's progress, to which they reply, "Good." Impressed by Damdiok's eloquence, Thor offers another round of compliments before initiating the final step. Thor raises his hammer and delivers a powerful blow, transporting Damdiok back home. As Damdiok disappears, Thor offers one final compliment and expresses his hope for a future meeting. The main character suddenly found himself back in his room and was worried that he might be in trouble, but he quickly pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the fact that he had finally awakened. His excitement was further amplified when he received a notification that his salary had been paid. Curious about the god's shop, he was amazed to find an array of legendary items and wondered if he could purchase them all. While considering his options, he realized that he lacked the necessary funds to buy Ares' power. However, he discovered that he could afford to purchase talents and was surprised at how inexpensive they were. He opted for a sword talent, which turned out to be an SS-class talent, and received an additional combat talent as a gift. As the system enhanced his physique, the protagonist passed out from the excruciating pain. When he regained consciousness a few hours later, he quickly checked his status window and was astonished by his stats. Suddenly, his mom called and warned him not to come to the hospital because a dungeon had appeared near it. The protagonist was shocked and rushed to the scene, where he activated his combat focus skill and gained a detailed view of his surroundings. Despite his efforts, he was not allowed to enter the hospital due to the maze-like structure of the dungeon. He was still reeling from the shock of the dungeon's appearance when he later discovered that he had built it. While lost in thought, the protagonist noticed an elderly man in distress and decided to help him evacuate. However, they were ambushed by lizard men, and the protagonist was forced to push the old man away to safety. He watched in shock as the elderly man was stabbed by one of the lizard men. Seeking refuge from the attack, he activated his combat skill, which helped him to easily dodge an incoming attack. Still in shock, the protagonist witnessed the lizard man approach the injured man. Without hesitation, he rushed to the old man's defense and wrestled the creature to the ground. He found himself surrounded by more lizard men, unsure of how to proceed. As he was attacked, his combat skill activated once more, allowing him to easily dodge the incoming strike. With more experience under his belt, the protagonist became more proficient in his abilities and began to attack the creatures. He managed to send one flying, but two remained. One of the creatures attacked, but the protagonist countered with a kick while dodging the other. The onlookers were stunned by his fighting skills. Suddenly, a man named Namgung from the Sangoon Guild appeared and complimented the protagonist's abilities. After exchanging handshakes, Namgung invited the protagonist to participate in a dungeon raid, to which the protagonist eagerly agreed. As they walk through the dungeon, the protagonist leads the way and guides the Sangoon Guild on which paths to take. He is pleased that he had memorized all the routes while building the dungeon. After a while, the protagonist insists on leading them, and although Namgung agrees, one of his subordinates is reluctant. As they proceed, the protagonist finds hidden traps and explains to the guild how they work and what to look out for. Namgung is shocked and asks how the protagonist knows all this, but the protagonist nervously responds that it's a business secret. They continue on until the protagonist suddenly stops them and tells them to prepare themselves. They defeat all the spiders in the room, and the protagonist is excited because he knows where all the spider eggs are and plans to burn them. However, before he can do so, he notices someone using his combat ability to asking for help. He stopped a subordinate from burning down the eggs and informs the guild master about the situation. Guild master Namgung informs his subordinates about the survivors in the dungeon and prioritizes saving them, urging the support team to follow the protagonist's orders. The protagonist is stunned by this and is about to speak with the guild master, but he is interrupted by a mysterious lady who calls out his name and asks him to guide them well. The protagonist exchanges pleasantries with her, and they engage in an awkward conversation. The lady proceeds to ask if the protagonist uses any weapons, and he explains that he does not. She advises him to carry a sword or two, and then she leaves. The protagonist is still stunned by what she said and wonders how she knew his name in the first place. After moving to the next floor, a swarm of spiders attacks the group. While the guild master and his subordinates fight the spiders, the protagonist rushes to save the survivors. Once all the survivors are rescued, Guild Master Namgung is impressed by the protagonist's skills and urges him to have a conversation. The Guild Master thanks the protagonist for his assistance and asks if he made the dungeon, to which the protagonist replies no. They decide to proceed to the next level of the dungeon, the Goblin Society. Standing in front of the door, the protagonist asks if he can complete the level alone, but the subordinates are reluctant and decide to go with him. As they enter, the protagonist urges them not to make a sound, but the subordinates ignore his warning and get noticed, resulting in the death of one of their comrades. The protagonist urges the rest to leave the level to him, and using his combat trait, he senses where the goblins are and kills them. The guild master compliments the protagonist's skill, but the protagonist insists that it was just luck. They proceed to the next level, which is the boss room. As the door opens, they see a minotaur sitting, and a notification appears stating that they need to sacrifice 5 people to the minotaur. The protagonist and the guild master make plans, but a jealous subordinate traps them in the room, making the minotaur attack them. The guild master blocks the attacks, but as the battle prolongs, he keeps getting pushed back. The boss prepares a final move to attack the guild master, and despite the protagonist's attempt to save him, they are both caught in the explosion. A sword appears in the protagonist's hands, strengthening him, and he attacks the minotaur with swift, precise moves. However, he couldn't deal any substantial amount of damage, and his sword eventually cracks. As the battle continues with both parties delivering devastating attacks, the protagonist's sword breaks. One of Namgung's subordinates throws a sword to him, and he uses it to deliver the final blow, defeating the dungeon boss. As they exit the dungeon, a crowd of people awaits them, cheering. The guild master thanks the protagonist for their heroism and urges them to make a statement. Overwhelmed with emotion, the protagonist joins the crowd in celebration. Let's cut to the hospital scene where our protagonist rushes to check on his mother and is relieved to find her safe and sound. As he watches the television in the hospital room, a news report comes on featuring an interview with him. Despite feeling overwhelmed by the questions, he explains that his motivation for participating in the dungeon raid was to protect his loved ones. Feeling embarrassed, the protagonist turns off the TV and is surprised to receive a notification informing him that his divine power has increased. He decides to browse job advertisements and comes across one for security management, which he finds intriguing. However, he decides to go home first before making any decisions. As he contemplates the job offer, he receives another notification informing him that several gods are also applying for the same job. This comes as a shock to him, but he quickly decides to apply and is transported to an unknown location. The protagonist soon came to the realization that he had arrived at Hephaestus Forges, but he was not pleased with how scorching it was. Out of nowhere, a mysterious figure emerged behind him and introduced himself as Hephaestus. Startled, the protagonist introduced himself and wondered if Hephaestus had overheard his complaints about the heat. Hephaestus proceeded to praise the protagonist for his bravery in fighting in Thor's dungeon and revealed that he had the audacity to request air conditioning in his smithy. Embarrassed, the protagonist apologized, and Hephaestus went on to explain the task at hand, pulling out a horn from a portal and blowing it. The sound summoned a group of dwarfs, whom Hephaestus introduced to the protagonist as his new team. While the protagonist exchanged pleasantries with them, Hephaestus whispered to him that the dwarfs were highly skilled but also incredibly problematic. He revealed that they had stolen a pendant he had planned to gift to Freya, the goddess of beauty, while working a few weeks prior. Hephaestus then handed the protagonist a weapon and explained that he needed to go to Mount Olympus for a day, urging him to take care of the smithy in his absence. Although the protagonist asked for more details about his mission, Hephaestus assured him that everything would be alright as long as he was stronger than the dwarfs. With that, Hephaestus left, leaving the protagonist with the dwarfs. As he exchanged greetings with the intimidating-looking dwarfs, the protagonist realized why Hephaestus had assigned them to him. Suddenly, they all pointed guns at him, stunning him before rendering him unconscious. Upon regaining consciousness, the protagonist finds himself tied to a pillar and is surprised to see 2 dwarfs in front of him. Despite feeling annoyed, he tries to intimidate them. The dwarfs, however, laugh at his threat and mock his reliance on Hephaestus for protection. One of the dwarfs then calls for their attention, giving the protagonist an opportunity to cut the rope. When the dwarfs turn their attention back to the protagonist, he threatens them again and they continue to mock him. The protagonist then frees himself with a knife, stunning the dwarfs, and strikes them, sending them flying. He ties them up and is relieved that he has a weapon, recalling the words of a mysterious girl and promising to thank her if they meet again in the future. Suddenly, something shiny catches his attention before the scene shifts to one of the dwarfs calling for their boss. As they prepare to leave, the dwarf captain, Red Fist, motivates the dwarfs, stating that Hephaestus has humiliated them enough and they will get revenge. The dwarfs shout in agreement, and the protagonist watches from a hiding spot, feeling confused. A group of dwarfs spot the protagonist and launch an attack. He takes cover behind a pillar while the dwarfs continue their assault. Red Fist, the dwarf captain, then approaches the protagonist and speaks to him. He offers the protagonist a choice, to either join them in raiding Hephaestus' forge or to leave and forget what he has seen. The protagonist is hesitant and weighs the consequences of each option, but ultimately decides not to let either happen. He realizes that he would rather fight the dwarfs than be killed by Hephaestus, and steps out with his hands up. The protagonist questions the dwarfs, asking why they are doing this and what they think Hephaestus will do to them if he finds out. One of the dwarfs becomes angry at the protagonist's words and shoots him. The dwarf then attempts to finish the protagonist off, but is stopped by Red Fist, who approaches the protagonist and begins to insult Hephaestus, calling him trash. The protagonist inquired about why Red Fist had referred to Hephaestus as trash. Red Fist proceeded to explain that Hephaestus had visited their mountain and was impressed with their skills. He had convinced them to work with him, and they had agreed to work only 5 to 6 hours per week. Initially, they were pleased with this arrangement, but they were unaware that their compassionate nature was being taken advantage of. They were essentially becoming slaves to Hephaestus, and if it weren't for this, they would have shared in his wealth. Red Fist revealed that this was why they wanted to seek revenge, and the protagonist jokingly agreed that Hephaestus was indeed trash. This statement enraged Red Fist, who ordered his men to attack, but the protagonist managed to stop them and urged them to listen to him. He called them cowards for attempting to flee and challenged them to a duel. One of the dwarfs became irritated and tried to shoot the protagonist, but Red Fist intervened and agreed to the protagonist's challenge. The protagonist was pleased that Red Fist had taken the bait and prepared for the upcoming battle. Red Fist launched an attack, but the protagonist evaded it. Surprised by the protagonist's strength, the protagonist responded by attacking without hesitation. Red Fist managed to dodge and counter with a massive blow, but the protagonist was able to avoid it and strike back successfully, dealing damage to Red Fist. Red Fist, impressed by the protagonist's strength, attacked with all his might. The protagonist urged him to bring it on, and they engaged in an intense battle, with the protagonist delivering devastating strikes and Red Fist retaliating. Suddenly, Red Fist remembered what smithy was and recalled the day when Hephaestus had first brought them there. He had constantly been reminded of his own inadequacy, causing him to blame someone competent for his own incompetence. As the protagonist was about to deliver the final blow, Hephaestus intervened and questioned what was going on. He acknowledged that he had expected them to fight but was surprised by the mess they had made. Afterwards, he turned towards Red Fist and gestured for him to clarify why his irons were out. Red Fist confesses to attempting to steal the iron, but before he can explain why, the protagonist interrupts and takes the blame for making him do it. The protagonist shows a pendant as an explanation, and Red Fist becomes frightened upon seeing it. However, the protagonist covers for Red Fist by saying they found it in the warehouse. Hephaestus is surprised and asks Red Fist if it's true, but before he can answer, Hephaestus is impressed by their care for his smithy and funding his necklace, so he doesn't ask any more questions. He compliments the protagonist and gives Red Fist his hammer while giving him words of encouragement. This brings tears to Red Fist and the other dwarfs. Later, Hephaestus calls the protagonist to thank them and reward them with a gift. The protagonist receives a box containing, curious to see what it is, he later discovers that it was a cute monster fox, which Hephaestus reveals can transform into any weapon in the universe. He jokingly offers it to the other dwarfs, but the protagonist joyfully accepts and names the fox Snow White. Hephaestus then transfers ownership to the protagonist and leaves. Before leaving, the protagonist is stopped by Red Fist, who questions why they lied to help them. The protagonist explains that he could relate to Red Fist's past and believes in living to help one another. Red Fist thanks the protagonist and hopes to repay the favor someday, despite the dishonor on his tribe's name. He thanks the protagonist again and urges his fellow dwarfs to get back to work. Next, we are shown Jibei, a 37-year-old hunter-manager who recently became the general manager of the country's largest hunter department store. Initially feeling good about himself, the scene shifts to him looking furious when he sees the protagonist approaching his store looking like a beggar to sell something. Despite this, Jibei welcomes him to the hunter department and takes him to the appraisal center, where an old man inspects the equipment the protagonist brought. The old man asks where he got the equipment, and the protagonist says he got it from a random person he knows. However, the old man then explains that the protagonist's equipment is all of the highest quality, 4-star equipment, and that he's the first person to ever want to discard items of this quality. Jibei is shocked and wonders where the protagonist got the equipment from. He takes the protagonist to the VIP room, where they negotiate the price of the items to about 3 billion. The protagonist is shocked by this and wonders why a bunch of Hephaestus failure weapons were worth so much. Jibei is determined to get his hands on the highest quality equipment and asks if the protagonist plans to sell them. However, the protagonist reveals that he plans to sell them all but not to Jibei, causing Jibei to lose his position within a week. The scene then cuts to the protagonist, who has already sold the equipment and is shocked to see so much money in his account. He immediately decides to go see his mom. After arriving at his mom's place with a bundle of gifts, she is shocked. However, their conversation is shortly interrupted by someone who shows her son on TV. Overwhelmed by her son's talent, she begins to cry tears of joy, but the protagonist urges her not to. As they watch the news together, the protagonist starts blushing as his mom watches in joy. Feeling good about himself, the protagonist applies for a job to exterminate lost spirits in Eden, with the reward of a golden apple that he believes could cure his mom's cancer. However, a breaking news report suddenly appears, showing a dungeon that has appeared, and Snow, who is frightened, hides in the protagonist's shirt. As a result, the protagonist suddenly has a vision that stuns him. He decides to leave and says goodbye to his mom before the scene cuts to a group of goblins battling hunters. Suddenly the protagonist appeared, gaining the attention of the hunters below. The leader of a group of soldiers is then informed by his men that there is a civilian in a restricted area. He orders them to apprehend the civilian, but upon seeing the journalists making up speculations, he decides to go there himself. Using his skill, Wind Gallop, he jumps up to where the protagonist is located and urges him to leave the area. However, the protagonist ignores him and continues to smile, which angers and stuns the leader. He tries to attack the protagonist, but he easily dodges and counters the attack. The protagonist makes a scene to gain attention, and a journalist remembers him as Yadamduk, who cleared the maze dungeon. After gaining enough attention, the protagonist jumps into a gate, stunning everyone, and enters a world restricted to gods. He tries to explore the world but is blocked by a force field due to his lack of divine power. Frustrated, he enters a cave that he saw earlier. Inside the cave, the protagonist defeats many goblins and searches for the boss of the dungeon. Suddenly, he is attacked by a red creature that turns out to be the dungeon boss. The protagonist easily dodges and breaks the boss's weapons, and then defeats it with a strike using snow. The protagonist was worried upon realizing that there was no notification indicating his victory over the dungeon boss. As a result, he made the decision to extract the core of the defeated boss as evidence. After extracting the core of the dungeon boss, he is stunned when the core begins to move. Out of nowhere, a notification pops up declaring that the core of the gate has been acquired, which will result in the gate's permanent disappearance. We are then transported outside the gate, where a group of people eagerly awaits the protagonist's return. Upon stepping out, the protagonist is taken aback by the crowd and bombarded with inquiries about how he entered the gate. Feeling pleased with himself, the protagonist is met with a barrage of questions. However, he persuades them to wait and goes on to explain how humanity can now demolish gates. The protagonist demonstrates this by destroying the extracted dungeon core, which causes the dungeon to disappear permanently. A woman is amazed and asks for the protagonist's identity, to which he replies, "I am Yadamduk." In a flash, news of the protagonist's achievement spreads worldwide, boosting his divine points. Just as he is about to check an important notification, a journalist interrupts him and urges him to deliver a speech. Suddenly, a mysterious woman from the Sangoon Guild appears, stunning everyone. She informs the protagonist that the guild master wishes to see him and encourages him to come along. In the next scene, the protagonist is shown in a room, shocked by its size. He remembers waiting for the guild master to return from a dungeon after arriving at the Sangoon Guild, which annoyed him greatly. Sitting down, he wonders if they called him to scout him out, but dismisses the thought and is amazed that such people were sent to call him. The focus then shifts to Ju Soyul, who rose to become one of the youngest next guild leaders of the Sangoon Guild and one of the 3 7-star hunters in the country, recognized by people worldwide. If she were a regular civilian in the Republic of Korea, she would have become a star among stars, acknowledged by everyone. Despite pondering on these thoughts, the protagonist is glad to check something and opens the part-time window, displaying a welcome message that greets him as Yadamduk. The system explains that he has been promoted to a low-class god, unlocking new features such as the power system, symbol system, and title system. The protagonist is prompted to choose a title, excitedly opting for a cool one at any cost. Upon seeing the list of ridiculous names for the title of gods, he is disappointed but eventually finds a good title after an hour of searching, God of Swords, which pleases him. Excited about the title, the protagonist decides to choose it and suddenly feels a surge of power flow through him upon being assigned the title. Catching his breath, the system notifies him that he has been enthroned as the sword god and blessed by a certain goddess. The protagonist sits down, sighing at how difficult it was to find a good name and recalls passing out while receiving his talent. A notification prompts the protagonist to choose a power of the sword god, revealing a vast collection of powers that shock him. Realizing he can finally use the power of a god, the protagonist sees that the system also mentions divine power but brushes it off since he isn't buying anything from the divine store. Not finding any dramatic powers to begin with, the protagonist chooses intuition as his first ability. His profile is then displayed, exciting him at how godlike it looks. Planning to check out his skills later, he is interrupted by someone knocking on the door. The protagonist initially considers if the visitor might be Duca Juicy, but soon realizes he went to the underwater dungeon. When he opens the door, he's surprised to see Ju Soyul standing there. She asks if she can come in, and he questions her about her visit. She explains that she's been asked by the guild master to give the protagonist an exclusive pass to the Sangu Guild, which allows him to access all the guild's facilities and accommodations. The protagonist wonders if this is part of her scouting strategy, but thanks her for the pass. She doesn't reply, and he thanks her again, leading to an awkward moment of silence. He feels that Ju Soyul has an odd vibe around her, and wonders why she's always quiet. As he's about to say something, Snow suddenly jumps on Ju Soyul, surprising him. He apologizes, but she says it's fine and compliments Snow. Soyul feeds Snow the snack and the protagonist is surprised that Snow likes her. He briefly considers if Snow likes women but dismisses the thought and wonders what Soyul is feeding Snow. When he asks, Soyul explains that it is a nutritional supplement. Snow happily returns to the protagonist, while Soyul bids him farewell and calls Snow by name, promising to see him next time. As Soyul walks away, the protagonist sighs and reflects on how difficult it was to talk to her. He notices that Snow really likes Soyul and then realizes that he never told her Snow's name. The scene cuts to Soyul smiling as she walks away, leaving the protagonist wondering how she knew Snow's name. Subsequently, we observe the protagonist browsing through his phone, searching for advice on how to handle a stalker. He contemplates his options with Ju Soyul and reflects that although she seemed normal, he never expected her to be a stalker. Suddenly, a notification appears, but he ignores it. However, he becomes increasingly frustrated as numerous notifications all at once. The system informs him that the part-time job he had requested has been updated. The protagonist is surprised and decides to investigate the job, which involves feeding Cerberus and comes with double the pay as a reward. The protagonist was taken aback by the sudden job offer and decided to push aside thoughts of the stalker girl. Without hesitation, he accepted the job but found himself suddenly transported to a dark, shadowy location where he was blinded by a beam of light. As his vision adjusted, he saw a frightening figure holding a lamp, which only added to his fear. Confused as to how he ended up on a boat, he was interrupted by the stranger who asked if he was dead. The stranger explained that they were on the river of Styx, where the dead were ferried to the underworld and where the living could not cross. The protagonist realized that the figure before him was Karen, the boatman of the underworld, and pleaded with him to help him cross the river. He explained that he had urgent business to attend to, but Karen flatly refused, greatly frustrating the protagonist. The protagonist persisted and asked where he could find Hades, the lord of the underworld, but this angered Karen. He chastised the protagonist for recklessly speaking Hades' name and threatened him. In a mocking gesture, the protagonist suggested other random titles for Hades, which only served to further infuriate Karen. Karen removed his scythe and urged the protagonist to leave, threatening him once again. Despite being the one to provoke Karen, the protagonist urged him to back off. This greatly annoyed Karen, who attacked the protagonist, only to be easily dodged. The protagonist calls upon Snow, and uses her to cut through Karen's scythe. Karen is shocked that the protagonist is holding an item like that and recognizes it as the same weapon Hercules used to beat him and cross the river alive. The protagonist interrupts him by wiping the club on his head and urges him to hurry up, but Karen asks him to pay for the fare. The protagonist gives him a menacing look, scaring Karen, who quickly prepares to leave and urges the protagonist to sit down. The protagonist arrived at their destination and thanked the Karen for the ride. However, when the protagonist looked away, the Karen attacked him, but the protagonist activated his sword god power, intuition, and easily dodged the attack. Realizing the power of intuition, the protagonist decided to beat up the Karen. After the beating, the protagonist was annoyed at the Karen for wasting his time but was interrupted by someone who asked if he was in charge of Cerberus. The woman introduced herself as the goddess of the underworld, Persephone. She explained that her husband was angry that there had been no reply to a job request and that if it weren't for the protagonist, he would have left the task to her. The protagonist introduced himself as Udumdak and was surprised to be speaking to Persephone. She offered to escort him to Cerberus, explaining that Cerberus was far away. She also revealed that her husband had asked her to stop bringing Cerberus to the front because many part-timers would run away upon seeing him. When the protagonist asked why her husband had made this decision, Persephone explained that her husband thought that only those with the skills to subdue Cerberus should be allowed to handle him. The protagonist realized that it must be a test. Although he was nervous, he reminded himself that he was the great sword god and that Cerberus was just a dog. When they arrived, Persephone pointed out that Cerberus was right in front of them. The protagonist saw the three-headed monster and realized how dire the situation was. However, a notification from the boss popped up, saying that the dog doesn't bite. Persephone asked if the protagonist was alright, and he said he was. She then handed him a paper with pet precautions that her husband had written and asked him to read it. Excited that Hades had thought everything through, the protagonist was shocked upon reading the pet precaution. He screamed, accusing Hades of wanting to kill him. Persephone urged him to check the daily schedule on the back of the page. Upon seeing that he was only asked to feed Cerberus, the protagonist tore up the paper in anger. However, Persephone warned him that the previous part-timer who had tried to back out had been caught by her husband and dragged to hell, where his limbs were torn apart. Frightened by the warning, the protagonist quickly glued the paper back together and asked Persephone where to start. She instructed him to feed Cerberus and showed him the meat carried by the nymphs. As the protagonist prepared to throw the meat, Cerberus growled excitedly, making the protagonist wonder if he turned into a dog in front of food. Persephone suddenly burst into laughter as the protagonist got covered in dirt. She referred to him as an interesting part-timer, and explained that there was no need to train Cerberus since the hound only obeyed her husband. This realization made the protagonist understand why no one had applied for the job in the first place. Annoyed, he threw meat at one of the heads of Cerberus, which made the other two heads laugh. He then threw meat at the other two heads as well, further escalating his irritation. The protagonist was greatly annoyed by this and suddenly attacked by Cerberus, but the chains that bound them prevented him from getting close. The protagonist laughed and mocked Cerberus, which only made him angrier. In the process, he broke the chains, which shocked Persephone. Suddenly, the protagonist was attacked, but he managed to dodge it. Persephone was amazed at how the chains had broken, but the protagonist told her it wasn't the right time to talk about it. He grabbed her hand and ran away. Persephone was shocked to see a wound on the protagonist's arm, but he assured her that it was just a graze. He continued to lament about how easily the chains had broken, but Persephone explained that it was her first time seeing it happen. The protagonist implores Persephone to flee, but she refuses and urges him to stay close to her. She explains that as the wife of the underworld's owner, Cerberus will not attack them if they are together. However, to their surprise, Cerberus attacks them anyway. The protagonist shoves Persephone aside and class out to snow using her as a weapon to strike Cerberus, but it has little effect. As a result, the protagonist is left vulnerable to attack and wonders why Cerberus is so powerful. As Cerberus approaches, Persephone warns the protagonist not to go near the river Styx, as the creatures there will immediately devour him. However, the protagonist's mind is foggy and he fails to heed her advice. Persephone realizes that the protagonist is not listening and commands Cerberus to stop, but he disobeys and continues towards the protagonist. Fearing he will become dog food, the protagonist rejects this fate and leaps into the river Styx, shocking Persephone, who calls out his name. As the protagonist drowns, he realizes his helplessness and contemplates whether he is dying. He experiences a sensation of floating in a dream and starts to question the validity of his past experiences, including his part-time job and his entire life. He recalls many things he wished to buy from a god shop but could not. His memories seem to detach from his body, and he begins to have flashbacks before his death. Despite urging Snow White to leave him, she swims down and bites his nose, causing him to scream in pain and snap out of the illusion. As something grabs his neck, he struggles to identify it while his consciousness gradually fades away. Desperate for a solution, he transforms Snow White into a giant hammer and uses the dwarf hammer's skill to create distance between himself and the unknown entity. The protagonist realized he couldn't breathe and quickly swam up to the surface with Snow White, grateful to have come back from the brink of death. Suddenly, Cerberus attacked him and bit him, but luckily, a notification appeared indicating that the Styx water effect would last for an hour, rendering the protagonist immune to poison, ailments, stuns, bleeds, and physical attacks. The protagonist remembered the legend of Thetis, who made her son invincible by dipping him in the river of Styx, except for his heels, which became his fatal weakness later known as Achilles' heel. As the protagonist realized he was completely soaked in Styx water, making him invincible, Persephone appeared in shock and attempted to pull him and Snow White out. Upon seeing them covered in Styx water, she called them filthy. The protagonist questioned her use of the word and she quickly apologized and asked if he was okay. She then inquired about how he was able to survive entering the Styx river, to which the protagonist was also unsure. Suddenly, Cerberus attacked again and bit the protagonist's hands, but the protagonist was unbothered and even yawned, asking if Cerberus was done. Persephone was astonished that a low-ranked god could survive being bitten by Cerberus and wondered if it was a blessing of immortality. The protagonist, looking quite cool, informed Cerberus that he had been given food but had not eaten it and then asked if they could go for a walk, calling Cerberus, doggy. Cerberus appeared visibly annoyed, prompting the protagonist to inform him that he wouldn't be taken out for a walk if he kept acting that way. This caused Cerberus to retreat, and the protagonist was pleased to have learned a trick like that while working at a pet shop. However, the protagonist was shocked when Cerberus returned with broken chains in his mouth. The protagonist fixed the chains but was interrupted by Persephone, who advised him to take it easy since Cerberus hadn't gone for a walk in a long time. Despite her concerns, the protagonist assured her that he had everything under control, only to be stunned when Cerberus dragged him away. As Cerberus dragged the protagonist, a skill suddenly activated that increased the wind speed. Persephone called out to the protagonist and urged him to use his divine power to strengthen his body. Although the protagonist was confused, Persephone insisted that Cerberus was too powerful, and he needed to tap into his divine power. This came as a great shock to the protagonist since he thought divine power wasn't a type of stat. When Persephone asked him if he knew how to use it, he admitted that he didn't know, which greatly surprised her. Persephone encouraged the protagonist to remember the feeling of using his power and suggested that he imagine controlling the water inside his body. Following her instructions, the protagonist tapped into his divine power and stopped Cerberus. Persephone then urged him to focus his strength on the specific part of his body he wanted to strengthen. The protagonist did just that and swung Cerberus into the air, shocking Persephone. He then smashed Cerberus to the ground, successfully using his divine power to defeat him. Despite the protagonist's decision to end their work and return, Cerberus refused to comply. As a result, the protagonist began dragging Cerberus, causing Persephone to be shocked. She was amazed that even though it was the protagonist's first time using his power, he was able to accomplish so much, calling him a great part-timer. The protagonist thought to himself that Persephone was strong and wondered why she didn't intervene. He asked if he could ask her a question, to which she agreed. He asked why she wasn't approaching Cerberus, explaining that he believed she could easily surpass him. Persephone was stunned by this and explained that there were restrictions in place. The protagonist was confused and asked her to clarify. Persephone explained that Cerberus prevented lost spirits from entering the mortal world and outsiders who tried to enter out of curiosity. She then revealed that she was one of those lost spirits who wanted to return. As we observe, our protagonist walks alongside Persephone and reflects on her limitations within the underworld. He notes that she is unable to do anything about Cerberus and is only permitted to lay her hands on a select few beings that Hades allows, such as himself. Recalling the mythological story of how Hades kidnapped Persephone and imprisoned her in the underworld, the protagonist initially thought it was absurd, but now realizes it to be true. He empathizes with Persephone, imagining the immense amount of time she must have spent alone, and finds it rather sad. He decides to set aside his sense of justice, recognizing that Persephone's husband is Hades, Zeus's brother, and contemplates what he could possibly do to help. His thoughts are interrupted by Snow, who seems upset. He apologizes for leaving her behind and they continue on, with the protagonist now seen dragging Cerberus. He notices something different about the creature, prompting him to question what had gotten into him. Persephone explains that Cerberus's duty is to chase after the dead, and despite his intimidating appearance, he performs his job quite well. This also explains why she is unable to leave, as she is bound by her responsibilities. She goes on to say that once the protagonist chains Cerberus to the pillar, his morning duties will be complete. The protagonist had a thought about a dog guarding a goddess and wondered if Hades was overly cautious. As he was preparing to chain Cerberus to the pillar, his intuition kicked in and he sensed something inside. Curious, he punched through the pillar and revealed a collar, surprising Persephone. The protagonist then explained that he saw something interesting inside. The system then revealed that the collar was actually Cerberus' training collar, which Hades used to train him. When the collar was worn, Cerberus would obey all commands given to him. Persephone expressed surprise upon discovering the collar with the protagonist and shared that she had searched for it unsuccessfully. She prodded the protagonist to explain how he found it, to which he replied that it was merely a hunch. The protagonist came to the realization that the collar was exceptional. Persephone confirmed this by explaining that Cerberus is a representation of the underworld, and whoever possesses the collar has authority over all of it. The protagonist objected to using it, as it belonged to Hades, but Persephone reassured them by saying that it was not prohibited. She shared that her husband would frequently ask her to find the collar, promising to allow her to train Cerberus if she did. The protagonist eagerly seized the opportunity and ordered Cerberus to let him put the collar around his neck. Although Cerberus was hesitant at first, the protagonist ultimately overpowered him and issued several commands, which Cerberus obediently carried out. However, Persephone suddenly interrupted their interaction, charming the protagonist and rendering him helpless. She revealed that her husband had given Cerberus two final orders: to monitor any attempts by the dead to escape the underworld and to keep an eye on her. As the protagonist succumbed to drowsiness, Persephone urged him to rest and assured him that she would return before her husband did. Despite his determination to resist, the protagonist could not resist the effects of Persephone's spell and drifted off to sleep. The protagonist abruptly awakens at the sound of Snow's voice. As he gradually comes to his senses, he realizes that he must have dozed off. When he scans the area for Persephone, he is surprised to find that she is nowhere in sight, much to his surprise. As he ponders how much time has passed, a notification pops up, indicating that the river Styx effect has less than 5 minutes left, bringing him to the realization that he hasn't been asleep for too long. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he implores Cerberus to manage the underworld while he rushes through hell, fearful that Hades will be furious if he discovers Persephone's escape. Desperately searching for Persephone, the protagonist suddenly realized that he possessed a skill called Wind Rush, which he quickly activated, granting him incredible speed. Upon reaching a certain location, he was astonished by the velocity of Wind Rush. He then utilized his divine power to propel himself into the air and caught a glimpse of Persephone on a boat. The scene shifted to Persephone, who was startled by a noise. As she investigated, she was taken aback by the sight of the protagonist emerging from the river Styx. The protagonist, with a fierce glare, demanded to know where she was heading. Frustrated, he began to berate her, but she implored him to remain calm, explaining that she merely wished to see her mother. The protagonist was taken aback by this realization, empathizing with Persephone's situation as he too cherished his own mother. Regretful, he acknowledged that she should have made better arrangements beforehand. However, Persephone calmed him down, assuring him that her husband would not return for 2 days and revealing a secret: she had never been caught leaving hell to visit her mother. Suddenly, the boat became stuck, causing them both to be surprised. With only 15 seconds remaining of the river Styx effect and fearing that the boat would not last much longer, the protagonist leapt into the river Styx, pushing the boat at incredible speeds. As they arrived at their destination, a bright shimmering light from the sun greeted them, which Persephone found refreshing. However, the protagonist interrupted her thoughts, urging her to promise that she would return to hell after seeing her mother. Persephone, in turn, advised him to remain calm, reminding him that she had never been caught before and inviting him to accompany her to visit her mother. Upon arriving at Persephone's mother's location, the protagonist was left astounded, questioning why Greek gods had a penchant for living in caves. As they entered the cavern, Persephone shouted out to her mother, the goddess of agriculture, Demeter. Stunned by her daughter's appearance, Demeter enveloped her in a tight embrace, filling the protagonist with delight. All of a sudden, the protagonist's attention was drawn to a flower, which he explained symbolized the mythological belief that while Persephone was in the underworld, all the flowers would wither due to Demeter's sadness. In their world, this was known as winter. The protagonist then decided to depart, much to Persephone's surprise. She questioned if he did not plan on keeping an eye on her, but he simply urged her to meet him at the river by 8 p.m. As he left, Persephone called out to him, thanking him. Upon arriving at the river Styx, the protagonist set up the boat to cross the river. He checked the time and realized that Persephone would arrive soon. However, he heard a noise and, thinking it was Persephone, turned around but was shocked to see a menacing-looking man, Hades. The system notified him of the danger, warning him that he would die. Hades, with a menacing expression, demanded to know the whereabouts of his wife.